All right, thanks very much, Philip. And I think your introduction is quite apt in that I'm environmental policy lead for the department, but I'm also responsible as, I suppose, head of profession for the Agricultural Inspectorate, which is a wide-ranging skill set within the department: agriculturalists, ecologists, foresters, ecotoxicology, people within the labs, etc. So there's a wide remit, I suppose, the department does, and ultimately the objective, though, is really to interpret the science and translate it into politics that makes it understandable. I think I work off a principle that if you want to kill a story, Philip is better at stories than I am, you make it scientific, long-term or complicated, and it's guaranteed to kill it before it ever starts. So I want to try and simplify a number of messages. I have a presentation. It'll be a little bit of everything because it's only 15 minutes, but the objective is to give it a sense of policy landscape. And I suppose I have 3 or 4 key messages that I'd like everybody to go away with as a result of today. And that is, one is, environment is critical for agriculture. And delivery of environmental performance is a huge challenge for the sector, but is critically important. And that's not driven by regulation alone, but effectively by consumer demand, public expectation, etc. So it is a big part of our role, our responsibility, our narrative. I spend about half my time challenging and fighting with farmers like Dennis, but I spend half my time defending them then. And that will come through, I think, in the presentation as well. The second thing to remember as well is that we will be asking farmers to do more. If you look at it, the trend or the lack of positive trend this morning is something we have to address, and that's well recognised within Food Vision. It's effectively a KPI in terms of the performance of the sector over the coming period, and therefore we need to address that. But at the same time, we need to recognise that we're asking a lot of farmers and have asked a lot, and that equally needs to be recognised. I had a neighbour once who was a great man for saying, you know, well, look at Bill, what you should do now is, or the other thing is, not telling you your business, but. And we all know at some point when somebody has had a drink or two what the response is to that. So I think we have to remove this narrative of, you know, just because we ask questions in relation to the policy directions, etc., that doesn't mean you're against it or you're completely for it. There has to be at least a conversation which is listening and recognising of the different standpoints that people come from in relation to that. And the last is, the Minister has asked me to chair a water group to look at what can the sector do, and I certainly look for feedback during the questions and answers from people here as to look at how do we engage, you know, more broadly in moving the dial, which is all our shared ambition. So, in terms of the overview, drivers of change, a little bit on agriculture, because I do think I need to address maybe some of the information that's out there. Actions, I will mention derogation. It's hugely emotive, divisive. And I just want to make a comment or two in terms of it. I want to be clear, my job is to implement government policy, but I do advise on, well, look, there are not ultimate solutions here, but just policy trade-offs. And that's the reality of the area that I work in on a day-to-day basis, and some key messages. If we look at it at EU level, the simple reality is, like the way I describe it is, Ireland is the second most food secure country in the world, in a continent that's food secure. That is not universally the case across the world. But increasingly, I suppose, in an urbanised society, we're being asked in agriculture in terms of contribution of not just food, but environment, etc. So I deal with climate change as well. So the way I describe that for climate is, we have to reduce emissions, we have to remove emissions. We're one of the few sectors that can do that, and we also contribute to energy from agriculture. And the way I see this developing into the future is there will be a lot through the likes of the bioeconomy of I suppose, oil-based solutions, whether it's packaging, whether it's timber products, whether it's a lot that will come from agriculture, whether it's carbon farming and carbon removal, that we certainly are looking at actively supporting, whether it's through research, policy development, etc., to that end. So Europe is expecting more from its land base than just food alone. And I suppose these are simple drivers to that in terms of whether it's the Water Framework Directive, whether it's the Nitrates Action Programme, or the Farm to Fork deal. And I suppose, look, there was a challenge to the Common Agricultural Policy earlier that I'd like to address, let's say, but food vision captures all those. And it is, I suppose, an attempt certainly to work with stakeholders to identify those priorities and at least generate momentum, a plan, shared objectives, because that's what's necessary in terms of moving. So that's my first message overall. In terms of the agriculture, if you look at it over the longer term, there is no doubt that the herd has grown, and significantly in terms of dairying, since 2010. But 2010 would have been generally quite a low point in terms of the national herd. So over a longer period, it's broadly static, the late 70s. So since 2017, by way of example, the herd is pretty much static in terms of numbers, but we have had an increase in dairy cows, a reduction in sucklers within that number. That has dramatically changed, particularly in the last year, where last year we would have lost about 25,000 sucklers, and these are basically a cow that rears the calf on farm, versus an increase of about 12,500 dairy cows within the system. So I suppose that increase that we've seen as the result of the removal of quotas is certainly petering out in terms of that dairy growth, but within the overall numbers, they're pretty static. Chemical fertiliser. This is a conundrum for me, because if you look at it since 2018, we've had a significant reduction, including last year. But that has not translated into the trends that we saw this morning in terms of the EPA. There are multiple reasons for that, whether it's an element of drought that we saw last year. So there's more at play than just volume in terms of nitrogen usage, which is, I think, my key message. 16% reduction, we're seeing that again this year in terms of a significant reduction, even on those numbers. But the question is, how do you build a system that, I suppose, can operate with less nitrogen? And they are a multitude of regulation, bringing down the allowances that are available to farmers, incentives in terms of alternatives such as supporting multi-species grass, supporting liming programs, supporting red clover, advisory from the likes of Teagasc, and Noel can talk about that later. So it's all a combination of different policy interventions that you look to, I suppose, the objective of how do you reduce fertiliser usage, which ultimately would have a positive in terms of water quality. Ground limestone, look at quite simply here, if you want to run an efficient system, you have to have a pH balanced. So therefore, the use of ground limestone really can drive, well, how do you reduce fertiliser usage by making a more efficient system? It's the same with if you want to reduce nitrogen, how do you better use your slurry? How do you ensure that that's better integrated into the nutrient plan for a farm on an annual basis? Just to give you examples then of just on the climate side and how they interact, we've set a target within our climate action plan to reduce to 330,000 tonnes of elemental nitrogen. Now that is quite a significant reduction, and a maximum usage of 300,000. 300,000, what does that figure mean? In 2018, that figure was 409,000 or 410,000. So it's a huge reduction. And how do you then ask the likes of Dennis to implement that or support it? But the big message I have to say is, as part of the engagement by the department, we have got stakeholder buy-in to those sort of ambitions and targets. They are not just being levied on industry, but creation of the Food Vision Dairy Group, the Food Vision Beef Group, and now the Food Vision Tillage Group. Our ultimate objective in terms of policy development is ensuring stakeholders are in the room in terms of supporting and agreeing to these objectives. Changing urea to protected urea, big objective, doesn't make a big difference for water quality because the nutrient is still within it. Reducing age of slaughter, very positive in climate, so in terms of water. Some actions are positive for both, so increasing organic farming. We have 256 million set aside within the CAP budget for increase in organic farming with an ambition of 450,000 hectares by 2030, and that's about 10%. So it's not insignificant in terms of ambition in development of that. An increase in the tillage area. Matt Dempsey is sharing a group. I sit on it in terms of how do we increase the overall, I suppose, sustainability of our system in terms of increasing our overall feed production within the country by developing the tillage sector. But these are all interconnected. Development of organic digestion as well. I do see an opportunity here. if you look at it, we're on the end of a pipe. It's a long, long pipe from Russia to here in terms of gas, or from the North Sea, so it makes a lot of sense that you get displacement of some of that energy profile with agriculture contributing. We don't get credit for the emission reductions associated with that. That falls to the energy system. We do get a modest benefit in terms of if you put manure through an anaerobic digester, then you're reducing the methane, you don't reduce the nutrient content. And we get, I suppose, a benefit in terms of an available diversification opportunity for farmers. And I actually chair an interdepartmental group. We'll have a strategy out by Q3 of this year in relation to development there. Afforestation then, increasing the targets significantly there as well, and also in terms of how we deal with peat soils under agricultural management is critical. We've put a lot of work in terms of understanding and a lot of investment. So we've supported Teagasc to put in what's called the National Agricultural Soil Carbon Observatory, because we just don't know what the emissions are associated with the peat soils are. We're using international inventories, we're using data which isn't, I suppose, ground-truthted in terms of the area of peat soils, etc., but they will have an indirect impact in terms of water quality, but principally climate-driven, but it is interconnected. Planting of cover crops is a real kind of, I suppose, win-win between climate and water. Conscious of time, Nitrates Action Programme. Really, look at just a couple of key messages from this. We have, by requirement, reduced the chemical nitrogen allowances that farmers can use in terms of their use. Asking them to use low-emission slurry spreading, which is not cheap technology. It takes a lot of change at farm level. Increasing the close periods. So in other words, trying to match nutrient application better to the growth curve within Ireland is critical. Banning of dairy cows, so no longer is a dairy cow a specific emission factor. It depends on her output as to, look at what's the association. But that directly impacts on farms in relation to, I suppose, the amount of stock they can carry, etc., which does have an impact on farms. Other changes, ruling out the opportunity to use inappropriately land to dilute, such as commonage, so putting in a maximum in terms of that, increasing the buffer strips, silage bales can't be stored in crude protein. Folks, don't get lost in the detail here. What I just want to convey is that we have a Nitrates Action Programme where there's a hell of a lot of change, a hell of a lot of additionality being asked in it, and this year we are going into a review process to look at, well, what additional should be asked of farmers. Non-GAP measures, introducing a fertiliser sales database, agreement with the industry being brought through the Parliament at the moment. We would hope certainly that it will be concluded before, when through primary legislation to be enacted before Dáil recess this year. Very significant piece of legislation. Improving compliance, increasing the inspection rate on derogation farms, and also the extension to agricultural sustainability. If you look at the tools that are available to somebody like me, the reality to my mind are you can increase regulation. It's challenging, necessary and important. You can incentivise supporting people to that objective. But critically also, you have to get market signals rewarding farmers for the right thing as well. Because that government can grease a wheel, but they can't run it. And if the market isn't responding in terms of supporting farmers on this objective, so engaging with industry, which we've done in terms of sustainability actions that they can support through bonus payments on the likes of milk, etc. But importantly for me, there are actions that can translate either into improved water quality or into inventory. And that's the big thing for us. How do we engage with industry in terms of those messages to farmers as well? Outside, water EIP, you heard the Minister, it's collaboration, it's 50 million from the Department of Agriculture, 10 million from housing in terms of, this will be announced in the near future by the Ministers. A civil servant is never ahead of a minister in terms of announcements, but given Minister Noonan mentioned it this morning, I feel free to at least identify it's progressing in terms of who will be awarded that contract. Capital allowances, again, another kind of example of how do you tweak the policy to support the objective. So if you want to reduce chemical nitrogen, you can use your slurry better. The way to do that is to avoid a situation where somebody is managing their tank space into a situation where they're managing their slurries. And allowing accelerated capital allowances where if a farmer builds additional slurry storage they can write that against tax over a shorter period is a way of encouraging that type of action at farm. Acres, 46,000 farmers gone into it. The evolution in agri-environment I describe as follows. Everybody loved the REP scheme in farming because it was general, it was broad-based, it was wide. That was evolved then into the next iteration, which was GLOS, which is around the right action. The next iteration was the right action in the right place. And Acres, however, is built on a different model, which is building on the likes of the Burren experience, where it's results-paid payment for farmers and collective approaches. So rewarding collective action by farmers, and over 20,000 farmers that have been taken into it, or sorry, 18,900 came in under a collective approach. So you're looking at landscape level in terms of actions a farmer can do with a payment based on results rather than penalties based on non-compliance. Very significant change. Eco schemes, discussion on CAP. Common agricultural policy has been massively reformed. There are 9 objectives, including environment in relation to that. But you've seen that effectively large parts of payments now are in respect of environmental dividends that farmer is contributing in relation to. And industry. As I said, how do we engage with industry where there's a top-up on payment for doing the right thing in terms of sustainability, but the consumer has to support that. The Minister has asked me to set up a water quality working group where we're looking at, we'll look at how do we work with stakeholders within farming to see what's the additionality can be brought forward in terms of for farmers, their own experience. And a couple we've met recently, and I suppose one of the things that I took away certainly was an appreciation. Farmers do want recognition of the work already done and not just criticism in terms of there's more to do. That's accepted, but there has to be a balance in terms of that. Derogation. It's very emotive. I suppose we have about 7,000 farmers in derogation. I want to be clear, however, that just if we didn't have a derogation in the morning, it would not resolve issues in relation to achievement of water quality. There are 2 reasons that I'll just say and then leave it, which is that the nitrates regulation is a limit on the amount of manure applied, organic manure applied, not present on a farm. It is not a limit on stocking rates. It's a limit on the amount of manure applied. So the concern, let's say, in terms of, for me, is if there's an expectation that it limits the farm's carrying capacity, that is incorrect. Because every pig farmer in the country is very intensively stocked, but they're required to have an adequate amount of spread lands, EPA controlled in terms of ensuring that the amount of manure is then, I suppose, spread appropriately in terms of that. And it's the same here in terms of, farms that are at that high level of intensity. They could manage it. They can, I suppose, avoid the requirements of derogation, where I tend to prefer having them inside the tent with additional requirements which we make of them, which are positive in terms of the environment. So there's a balance. The second thing is, if you're looking at those land uses, whether it's forestry, organics, increasing tillage, I suppose you do have to reflect that just spreading the herd out puts pressure on land. And that's already seen this year, where effectively farmers are paying very significantly higher rates of rent for additional land where they're perceived as at risk of having to cut numbers. And that impacts on other sectors, whether it's going to be organics, whether it's going to be tillage, who are equally dependent on that land. So there are no solutions, but policy trade-offs, I suppose, was my point. Key messages: agriculture has to do more, and the environment is critical to agriculture. Farmers are impacted, but they understand that. We need to recognise that effort. There are co-benefits for the farming sector. As I said, it's not just regulation, it's consumer demand. I describe to farmers often that if you look at the food pyramid, for me, it's very different to everybody's traditional food pyramid. The first principle everybody looks at in terms of food is its availability. If you're hungry, nothing else matters, and there is a lot of people in this world hungry. Availability is their milestone. The second one then is safety. That is not universally available worldwide in terms of food safety. We've seen that, and we have a very high food safety standard here in Ireland. The next level above that is its sustainability. And the consumer of today wants to know the sustainability metrics, and the market that we're feeding into expects to know the message that's there around food production and its sustainability credentials. And above that then, in my view, is food and health. People's expectation that what I eat is good for me. I know you don't want a big man in front of you telling you that, but that's the reality of the consumer of today is more conscious of how food impacts in terms of their health. And that, to me, is the food pyramid in terms of the impacts. Key priorities for the Ag Working Group for me is individual understanding. So how do we connect? This is a question I'm asking. I'm chair of the group, so I don't want to preempt what the outcomes of the group is. But we have to look at how do farmers understand water quality locally. As people in this room can contribute to that discussion in terms of directly connecting them to an understanding of what's happening rather than a nebulous, highfalutin discussion in terms of water. Improving compliance and enforcement. We have to look at that as well in terms of, it's often said in farmers, he's his old worst enemy about somebody down the road. I've told farmers, he's your worst enemy. I'm gender neutral. It's he or she is your worst enemy, but the reality is a lot of farmers are male. But I think farmers understand that themselves and are quite comfortable with the idea of improved compliance. And also we do have to look at additional measures that are based on science in terms of the actions.